Shocking developments tonight in the search for Lynette Hooker. You may remember her husband said she fell overboard in the Bahamas back in April. She still hasn't been found. The Coast Guard is now reopening its search because officials say his story doesn't add up. George Solis has been following this one for us. And George, they noticed a discrepancy with the GPS of the boat?
Yeah, that's right, Tom. This is a stunning turn of events. The U.S. Coast Guard is reopening its search because they say GPS data from the couple's boat contradicts what her husband, Brian Hooker, told investigators about where they were the night she went missing, according to a U.S. official. Now, Hooker was released from custody in the Bahamas more than a month ago. And you'll remember, Tom, he told us he was going to keep searching for his wife. But a day later, his attorney told us he left the Bahamas, saying he was going to take care of his mother. Now, his stepdaughter has said that the two had a volatile relationship.
The Royal Bahamas Police Force has granted permission to the United States Coast Guard to send divers into the Sea of Abaco. Read that again. Permission granted, divers going in. Because Brian Hooker's own GPS data recovered from his electronic devices by federal investigators contradicts everything he told them about where he went, about where the couple traveled that night, about where Lynette is. And then a viewer left a comment that stopped the internet. Technology does not lie. Only people do. Somebody knows more, a lot more. That single line said in 8 words what this entire investigation has been building toward for nearly 2 months. And within hours it had been liked, shared, and echoed across the internet by thousands of strangers who had never met Lynette and never sailed a day in their lives. But they felt it because it was true. By the time people around the world were asking where the yacht Azora was, questioning the GPS tracks, demanding answers about the crew and captain connected to this case, one woman had already vanished without a trace. Lynette Hooker was supposed to be living the dream. For years, she and her husband Brian documented a life most people only imagine. Sailing through turquoise Bahamian waters, chasing sunsets across the Abacos, building a social media following around 2 people who had left ordinary life behind forever. The boat was called Soulmate, and from the outside it looked exactly like that. Then on a dark night in the Abaco Islands, Lynette disappeared. Brian's explanation sounded simple. Rough seas, a small dinghy, an accident, a woman swept away by the ocean. But as investigators dug deeper, the story became harder to believe. GPS data revealed movements that did not match Brian's account. Federal investigators reopened searches in previously unexplored waters. The Coast Guard seized the couple's vessel. An infrared camera aboard the yacht became part of an active criminal investigation. And with every new development, one question grew louder. What really happened to Lynette Hooker? Was this a tragic accident in unforgiving waters, or was the ocean being used as the perfect crime scene? Tonight, follow the digital breadcrumbs, the conflicting timelines, the mysterious vessels, and the forensic evidence that transformed a missing persons case into an international true crime investigation. One where technology may know more than the only witness left alive. The Royal Bahamas Police Force granted permission to the United States Coast Guard to send divers into the Sea of Abaco because Brian Hooker's own GPS data contradicts everything he told investigators about where he went and where Lynette is. That is where we start. Before anything else, Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. His Bahamian attorney told major news outlets he categorically and unequivocally denies any wrongdoing. Brian has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing in connection with his missing wife. His attorney declined to comment on the new search request, citing the ongoing investigation. We carry that through every part of this story, every time. So let me take you back to April 4th. Because understanding that night, and understanding exactly where Brian's story falls apart, is the foundation of everything else we are going to cover. Brian says he and Lynette left a local establishment at around 7:30 in the evening. They got into their 8-foot rigid dinghy to head back to Soulmate, anchored approximately 1,000 yards south in Aunt Pat's Bay, a 12-minute ride in calm conditions. He claims the seas were rough, 2 to 4 foot waves, winds building toward 20 knots, and somewhere in that short stretch of water, Lynette went overboard. She allegedly had the spare engine key in her dry bag. The engine died. He could not reach her. The current and wind drove them apart, and he drifted for 9 hours before washing up on the shore of Marsh Harbor at 4 in the morning. That is his story, and essentially every piece of it is contradicted by documented evidence. The weather. Multiple witnesses, video footage, and photographs from that exact location at that exact time show conditions that were flat and calm. Not 2 to 4 foot seas, not 20-knot winds, glass, the drift. A friend of both Brian and Lynette, who conducted his own drift demonstration, concluded the distance Brian claims to have covered at the wind speeds he described should have taken approximately 5 hours, not 9. The direction. Brian told Fire and Rescue that Lynette was swimming toward the boat. He told others she was swimming toward shore. He told the boatyard security guard that she was swimming toward Hopetown with a yellow bag. Hopetown is north. The boat was south. Those are opposite directions. And Lynette's dry bag was green, not yellow. The timing. Brian told the rest of the world it happened around 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the evening. He told one witness it occurred at 7 o'clock. At 7 in the evening in the Abacos in early April, it is still light, not dark. Not the conditions he described to everyone else. The flares. Brian told Lynette's mother that he fired 2 flares. Physical evidence from the dinghy shows only one was discharged. There was still a flare in the gun, the terrain. A volunteer searcher filmed what Brian would have had to walk through to reach the subdivision he says he knocked on doors in. Mangroves, standing water, black sludge, ravines in pitch black in blue slides, while the boatyard blazed with light 150 yards to the north along the rocky shore. And the person who was physically there when Brian boarded the rescue vessel that morning said those blue slides showed no sign of mud, or sludge, or muck. Every single detail falls apart when you examine it carefully. Now, this is what everything has been building toward, and I need you to hear every word of it. The U.S. Coast Guard will send divers to new locations in its search for Lynette Hooker after investigators found inconsistencies between her husband's location data and his statements to investigators about where to search for his wife. Let me say that again, because the language matters here. Inconsistencies between her husband's location data and his statements to investigators. That is a United States official saying that Brian Hooker's own GPS data does not match what he told federal investigators about where he went, about where the couple traveled that evening, about where investigators should be searching. Forensic evidence recovered from Brian Hooker's electronic devices has led investigators to new areas of interest that were previously not searched. And one United States official confirmed the information Hooker told investigators does not match the GPS data from his electronic devices. The Royal Bahamas Police Force has already granted permission. The permission is not pending. It is not being negotiated. It has been granted. Coast Guard divers are going into the Sea of Abaco to locations that Brian Hooker's own device recorded. Locations he never told anyone about. Locations that nobody has searched before. A source in the Bahamas confirmed the new search will focus on an area of the Sea of Abaco with waters reaching 25-foot depths. 25 feet, deep enough that aerial grid searches conducted by Coast Guard planes, which have been flying since the earliest days of this investigation, would not necessarily have seen anything on the bottom. Only divers going to the specific coordinates will find what is there. GPS data derived from one of Brian's devices showed the device on the water, stopping in the Sea of Abaco and returning to shore. Not drifting, not helpless, stopping at a specific location and coming back. That is not the movement of a man who lost his wife and drifted for 9 hours at the mercy of wind and current. That is the movement of a man who went somewhere deliberately, stopped, and came back. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. His attorneys maintain his innocence. But his own GPS data is now directing federal divers to places he never mentioned. And the Bahamas has said, yes, go look. Now let me explain how this GPS data was actually generated, because I think when you understand the mechanics of it, the significance becomes even clearer. Brian Hooker had multiple devices. Multiple phones, multiple tablets, and what investigators and researchers found by going through Brian and Lynette's social media carefully, 2 different watches. A big white one that he was wearing when released from Bahamian custody, and a second watch, greenish-black, visible in older social media posts. Now that second watch matters a great deal. The friend of both Brian and Lynette, who has been one of the most important sources throughout this investigation, demonstrated this on camera. He held up his own watch, a Garmin Quatic sailing watch, and he showed exactly what it does. You can build GPS routes on it. You can navigate in complete darkness to a specific coordinate. You can track your exact position on the water in real time. Every movement, every stop, every depth recorded, time-stamped. And he said when he ran his own drift demonstration for this case, the data he sent came from his watch, not from his phone, not from any other device, from his watch. Now, the theory, and I want to be clear, this is analysis, not confirmed fact because Brian has not been charged, is this. If Brian put on a marine navigation watch and went out in the dinghy in the dark, that watch recorded everything. Every location, every stop, every depth of water beneath him at each point. The return to shore, all of it time-stamped, synced to app servers, stored remotely. And he could not delete that. Not retroactively, not from the watch logs, not from the apps it synced to, not from the servers those apps stored the data on. The renewed dive search is based on GPS data from Brian Hooker's phone on which he was using a marine navigation app. And a United States official confirmed that the Hooker's dinghy allegedly visited the same area as that GPS data shows. The dinghy visited the same area as the GPS data shows. That is a United States official confirming that Brian's own GPS device and the dinghy were in the same location. A location Brian never told investigators about. A location in 25-foot deep water that federal divers are now going to search. Now let me tell you about what was on Soulmate. Because Brian, a former telecommunications technician who worked his own boat and by his wife's own description was geeking out on all the electronics, understood every system on that vessel. And every one of those systems was keeping a record. There were cameras. A security camera system was installed on Soulmate. These cameras upload to cloud storage automatically. Amazon servers accessible by federal subpoena regardless of what happened to the physical devices on board. A camera at the stern of the pilot house facing forward, a camera at the bow facing back, covering every angle of the cockpit, and at least one camera below deck, all of them potentially recording on the night of April 4th. There was the battery management system. A new system installed after a lightning strike damaged the original. And newer battery management systems log every electrical event with a precise timestamp. Every time a light comes on, every time the water pump runs, every time a device charges, every time the stove fires, every time a human being is aboard that boat using power, the log records it. If anyone was on Soulmate after 7:30 on April 4th, that log shows it. If the boat was truly empty and dark, as Brian says, the log shows that too. There was the Starlink satellite terminal mounted high on the mast. Any device that came within range, any phone, any watch connected to a phone, would automatically connect to the Soulmate network. That connection was logged, time-stamped on SpaceX servers, accessible to federal investigators under a Department of Justice subpoena. Regardless of what Brian did with any physical device on that boat. There was the AIS, the automatic identification system that broadcast the vessel's position. It went offline at 9:29 in the evening on April 4th and came back on at 8:34 the following morning. 11 hours on a boat with hundreds of watts of solar power. That does not happen accidentally. And there was the FLIR thermal camera. A friend of the couple said Soulmate was equipped with a FLIR infrared thermal imaging system worth approximately $33,000. It can detect heat signatures in complete darkness. It can track a body in dark water automatically. It is exactly the kind of equipment search and rescue teams use to find people in open water at night. Brian Hooker says his wife went into the water. He says he could not find her. He says the dark and the current took her away. He had a $33,000 thermal camera on his boat that could have found her. He never turned it on. Not that night. Not the next morning when he was below decks on Soulmate for an hour with a police officer. Not ever. Investigators are working to extract data from devices aboard the vessel, including an infrared camera that may contain additional clues surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance. Additional evidence continues to be processed at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The technology was watching. It was recording. It was keeping a perfect record. Brian did not turn all of it off. Now here is something that has been confirmed, and I think it tells you exactly where this investigation is heading. Soulmate has been moved from the Coast Guard station in Fort Pierce, 100 miles south, to the Coast Guard station in Fort Lauderdale. The reason? Authorities did not have the capability to pull it from the water in Fort Pierce. Fort Lauderdale has that capability. Pull it from the water. Those 4 words are the entire story. When a vessel is hauled out of the water entirely, when it sits on blocks in a covered dry dock facility, investigators can access every inch of it. The hull below the waterline, the keel, the through-hull fittings, the underbody, every surface that has been submerged since the night of April 4th, all of it becomes reachable. All of it becomes examinable. And then there is preservation. Once Soulmate is out of the water, it can be sealed, protected from the elements, potentially shrink-wrapped. Every surface, every compartment, every piece of evidence on that vessel frozen in its current state, ready for whatever legal proceedings follow, ready to be wheeled into a courtroom if it comes to that. The boat Lynette funded, the boat she called home, the boat she sewed bimini for with her own hands, that boat is now federal evidence heading toward dry dock. And the people best equipped to examine every inch of it are about to have access to parts of it they have never been able to reach before. Now here is the one question that this entire global conversation has been asking since the beginning, and it is the question our viewer comment pointed to directly. Where is the yacht Azora and its captain and crew? Azora was anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th, right alongside Soulmate, close enough that its occupants could have had a clear view of that anchorage all evening. The Coast Guard Investigative Service has issued an appeal to locate the owners and occupants of a sailboat moored near Soulmate the night Lynette disappeared. The memo states the owners and occupants of that vessel may have information relevant to the investigation. So what might Azora's crew have seen or heard? After 9:30, when the island had settled and ambient noise had faded, a witness reported hearing a massive splash coming from the direction of Soulmate, loud enough to register, loud enough to remember. And at around midnight, a resident who lives facing the anchorage had video running. That video captured light events on what appears to be Soulmate. Lights going on and off, low near the waterline where a dinghy would be higher up on deck. At midnight, when Brian says nobody was anywhere near that boat. If Azora was there, if its crew was awake at 8 and 9:30 and midnight, they may have witnessed all of it. The flare, the splash, the lights, they may have watched everything happen. If you know anything about the vessel Azora or its crew, if you were in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th, please submit that information through the CGS Tips application, anonymous, iOS, and Android. Now, before we get to what comes next, I want to talk about something that has been in this case from the beginning, but that becomes more significant with every new development. Brian Hooker threatened to throw Lynette overboard before any of this happened. A close friend said that in 2024, during a breakup period, Lynette revealed to her that Brian had choked her and threatened to kill her and throw her overboard so that nobody could find her. And in January of 2025, just 3 months before Lynette disappeared, Lynette told her friend about that threat again. 3 months before she vanished from a boat in the ocean. A police report from 2015 documented a domestic incident between Brian and Lynette. Lynette told officers Brian had choked and struck her during that altercation. The case was eventually dropped. Brian was not charged, but it was documented by police on paper with a case number. Another friend said that during the separation period, Lynette said she could not cruise with Brian anymore and be alone on a boat with him. And Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother, said the last time she saw her daughter, she told her not to go back. She was afraid of what was going to happen. Lynette had a plane ticket to leave Brian on March 11th, just 3 weeks before she disappeared. She never used it. And now federal divers are going into the Sea of Abaco to GPS coordinates from Brian's own device, looking for Lynette in 25-foot deep water. Family members of Lynette Hooker have provided DNA samples to aid in the investigation. Darlene, her daughter Carly, Lynette's father, all three ready, waiting, so that when those divers find something, identification can happen immediately while the team is still on the ground. He threatened to throw her overboard. He said nobody would ever find her. And now divers are going to the coordinates his own device recorded to find out if he was right about that last part. Brian Hooker has not been charged. His attorneys maintain his innocence. We state that every time. Let me bring everything together. A viewer wrote, "Technology does not lie, only people do. Somebody knows more, a lot more. Where is the yacht Azora and its captain and crew?" They were right on every count. The technology was not lying. It was never lying. The GPS device recorded where Brian went on the night of April 4th. The marine navigation app logged every stop. The Starlink terminal logged every connection. The battery management system logged every electrical event. The cameras were recording. The AIS went offline at 9:29 and came back on at 8:34. All of it was keeping a perfect record. The U.S. Coast Guard will send divers to new locations in its search for Lynette Hooker after investigators found inconsistencies between her husband's location data and his statements to investigators. The Royal Bahamas Police Force has already granted permission. The information Hooker told investigators does not match the GPS data from his electronic devices. A United States official said that on record. Soulmate is heading to dry dock at Fort Lauderdale. The FBI is processing evidence at Quantico. DNA samples are collected from 3 family members. Coast Guard divers are going into 25-foot deep water in the Sea of Abaco at coordinates Brian's own device recorded. Locations he never mentioned to a single investigator. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. His attorneys say he is innocent. His attorney declined to comment on the new dive search. Those are the facts and they matter, and we say them every time. And Lynette Hooker has been missing for 54 days. She was 55 years old. She chose this life deliberately. She loved the ocean. She documented every beautiful and difficult day on it. She called it her happy place. She ran with her daughter. She sewed the bimini on her own boat. She bought healing oil for her husband's nail fungus. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like they had hit the lottery just by knowing her. And the technology that surrounded her life on that boat, the cameras, the GPS, the logs, the servers, it was watching on the night she disappeared. It kept a record. Brian thought he understood it well enough to outsmart it. He worked that boat himself. He understood the systems, but he could not reach back in time and delete what the GPS had already stored. He could not wipe a server at SpaceX. He could not erase a Starlink connection that had already been logged. He could not reach into the cloud and take back what the cameras had already uploaded. Technology does not lie, and federal divers are going into the water right now, following the coordinates it recorded, to bring Lynette home. The investigation into Lynette Hooker's disappearance represents a watershed moment in how modern criminal investigations intersect with digital forensics. What we're witnessing unfold in the Abaco Islands is a case study in how contemporary surveillance technology, even when installed for benign purposes like navigation and security, creates an indelible digital footprint that becomes nearly impossible to erase or manipulate after the fact. Consider the sophistication of the marine navigation ecosystem that existed on Soulmate. This wasn't just a simple GPS unit bolted to a dashboard. This was an integrated network of interconnected systems, each logging data independently, each syncing to different cloud servers, each creating redundant records that would require simultaneous access to multiple corporate server infrastructures to eliminate. The complexity of this technological web is precisely what makes it so valuable to investigators and so dangerous to anyone who might have something to hide. The Garmin Quatix watch that likely played a central role in recording Brian's movements represents a particularly fascinating element of this technological puzzle. These marine-specific smartwatches are designed for serious sailors who need precision navigation capabilities on their wrist. They can plot courses, mark waypoints, record tracks, and sync all of that information to Garmin's cloud infrastructure automatically whenever the watch comes within range of a Wi-Fi network or pairs with a connected smartphone. What makes this particularly significant is the passive nature of the data collection. The wearer doesn't need to actively choose to record their movements. The watch does it automatically as part of its normal functioning. Every time Brian's wrist moved, every time his elevation changed, every time the watch detected movement from one GPS coordinate to another, it was creating a record. And unlike a phone that might be deliberately left behind or turned off, a watch is something people tend to keep on their person, especially if it's a critical navigation tool they rely on. The Starlink terminal on Soulmate's mast adds another layer of digital surveillance that Brian may not have fully appreciated. Starlink isn't just providing internet connectivity to the vessel. It's also logging every device that connects to that network, creating a map of when phones, tablets, watches, and other electronics came within range of the boat and established a connection. These connection logs are stored on SpaceX servers and include MAC addresses, which are unique identifiers for electronic devices that can't be easily spoofed or changed. If Brian's phone or watch connected to the Soulmate network after the time he claims to have left the vessel, that connection would be logged with a precise timestamp. If his devices connected, disconnected, and then reconnected later, each of those events would be recorded separately. The pattern of connections and disconnections can tell investigators a story about movement and presence that either corroborates or contradicts the timeline Brian has provided. The battery management system represents yet another independent data stream that investigators can cross-reference against Brian's account. Modern marine battery management systems are sophisticated pieces of equipment that do far more than simply monitor charge levels. They log every electrical event on the boat because understanding power consumption patterns is critical to managing limited electrical resources on a cruising sailboat. When the cabin lights came on, the battery management system noted it and recorded the exact time. When the water pump cycled to provide pressure to the galley faucet, that electrical draw was logged. When the refrigeration compressor kicked on to maintain cold storage temperatures, the battery system recorded it. When a phone or tablet was plugged in to charge, that load on the system was documented with a timestamp. All of these electrical events create a narrative of human activity aboard the vessel. An empty boat has a very different electrical signature than an occupied boat. Someone moving around in the cabin, using lights, using water, using appliances, creates a pattern of power consumption that the battery management system dutifully records. If Brian's account of an empty, dark vessel is accurate, the battery logs will show minimal electrical activity consistent with an unoccupied boat. If someone was aboard Soulmate during the hours Brian claims to have been drifting helplessly at sea, the battery system will have recorded the evidence of their presence. The security cameras installed throughout Soulmate represent perhaps the most direct form of digital surveillance on the vessel. Modern cloud-connected security cameras like the Blink system have fundamentally changed how video surveillance works. In the past, security cameras recorded to local hard drives or SD cards that could be physically removed and destroyed. But cloud-connected cameras upload their footage to remote servers in real time, or near real time, creating a backup that exists beyond the physical confines of the location being monitored. Amazon, which owns the Blink camera brand, maintains these video archives on their server infrastructure. The footage doesn't exist on the cameras themselves in any meaningful sense. It exists in the cloud, on servers in data centers that Amazon operates, protected by corporate security protocols and accessible to law enforcement through proper legal channels like subpoenas and warrants. Even if Brian had removed the cameras from the boat, even if he had thrown them into the ocean, even if he had smashed them with a hammer, the footage they had already uploaded would remain intact on Amazon's servers. The cameras were just the collection mechanism. The actual evidence exists in a place Brian could never reach, could never access, could never delete. The positioning of the cameras on Soulmate is particularly noteworthy. A camera at the stern of the pilot house facing forward would capture anyone approaching the boat from astern, which is the typical approach angle for a dinghy coming alongside. A camera at the bow facing aft would capture the length of the deck and anyone moving around in the cockpit area. A camera below deck would record activity in the cabin. Together, these cameras create overlapping coverage that would make it very difficult for someone to move around the vessel without being captured on video. If Brian returned to Soulmate after claiming to have left, if he was aboard the vessel during the hours he describes drifting at sea, if there was activity on the boat at midnight when witnesses on shore observed lights moving around, the cameras would have recorded it. And that footage, if it exists, is sitting on Amazon's servers right now, waiting for federal investigators with the proper legal authority to access it. The AIS, or Automatic Identification System, shutdown presents one of the more intriguing technical mysteries in this case. AIS is a mandatory safety system on many vessels that broadcasts the boat's position, course, and speed to other vessels and to shore-based receiving stations. The system is designed to prevent collisions and to allow authorities to track vessel movements for safety and regulatory purposes. For the AIS to go offline at 9:29 in the evening and remain offline for 11 hours before coming back online at 8:34 the following morning is highly unusual. AIS systems are designed to run continuously. They draw minimal power, and on a boat with hundreds of watts of solar charging capacity and a well-maintained battery bank, there's no technical reason for the system to shut down. The timing of the AIS shutdown is particularly significant. 9:29 in the evening is after the time Brian claims to have left Soulmate with Lynette in the dinghy, but before the time witnesses reported seeing unusual activity around the vessel. The AIS remained off through the period when a flare was seen firing horizontally from the direction of the boat, through the period when a loud splash was heard, through the midnight hour when lights were observed moving around the vessel, and didn't come back online until the morning after Brian had been rescued. This suggests that someone with knowledge of the vessel's systems made a deliberate decision to disable AIS broadcasting during a specific window of time. Someone who understood that having the boat's position publicly broadcast and logged by coastal receiving stations would create a record that might be problematic later. Someone who knew where the AIS controls were and how to turn the system off and back on. The fact that the AIS came back online the following morning, after Brian had already been picked up by rescue personnel, raises questions about who reactivated the system and why. If the boat was unoccupied, if Brian had been drifting at sea all night as he claims, who went aboard Soulmate that morning and turned the AIS back on? The FLIR thermal camera represents one of the most damning pieces of unused technology in this entire case. A $33,000 infrared thermal imaging system is not a piece of equipment you install casually on a cruising sailboat. This is sophisticated search and rescue grade technology, the same type of system used by Coast Guard helicopters and professional rescue vessels to locate people in the water at night. FLIR systems work by detecting the heat signature difference between a human body and the surrounding water. Even at night, even in complete darkness, even in rough conditions with poor visibility, a FLIR camera can identify the thermal signature of a person in the water from a significant distance. The technology is so effective that it's become standard equipment for professional search and rescue operations in maritime environments. Brian and Lynette had this technology installed on their boat. It was mounted, operational, and available for use. If Brian's account is accurate, if Lynette went into the water unexpectedly and he was searching desperately for her in the dark, the FLIR camera would have been his single best tool for locating her. He could have gone back to the boat, activated the thermal camera, and swept the area systematically, looking for her heat signature against the cooler background of the ocean. He didn't do that, not that night. Not the next morning when he was aboard Soulmate for an hour with a police officer before full search and rescue operations were mobilized. The FLIR camera remained unused while the window of time in which it might have made a life-saving difference closed. The question that this raises is almost impossible to answer in a way that's consistent with Brian's account of events. If you believe your spouse has gone into the water, if you have access to technology specifically designed to find people in the water at night, why would that technology remain unused? The only explanations that make sense are either that Brian didn't actually believe Lynette was in the water to be found, or that he had reasons for not wanting to locate her. The volunteer searchers' documentation of the terrain between where Brian claims to have come ashore and where he claims to have sought help provides powerful physical evidence that contradicts his account. The journey from the beach to the residential subdivision where Brian says he knocked on doors would have required traversing some of the most challenging terrain in the Abacos. Mangrove swamps are nearly impenetrable environments. The vegetation is dense, tangled, and grows in standing water mixed with thick organic mud that can be waist-deep in places. The root structures create natural barriers that are difficult to navigate even in daylight with proper footwear. Attempting to traverse mangroves at 4 in the morning in pitch darkness while wearing slide sandals would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. The changes in Brian's story about what direction Lynette was swimming reveal the kind of inconsistency that emerges when someone is constructing a narrative rather than recalling actual events. Remembering which direction someone was swimming is not the kind of detail that should change between tellings, especially in a traumatic event where those details would be seared into memory. Brian told fire and rescue personnel that Lynette was swimming toward the boat. He told other people she was swimming toward shore. He told the boatyard security guard she was swimming toward Hopetown with a yellow bag. These can't all be true. Hopetown is north of the anchorage. The boat was south of the anchorage. Shore was to the west. These are completely different directions that can't be reconciled with each other. And the detail about the yellow bag is particularly telling because Lynette's actual dry bag, the one that was recovered, was green. Not yellow-green, not greenish-yellow, not a color that could be confused in different lighting conditions. Green. If Brian actually saw Lynette swimming with her dry bag, he would know what color it was. The fact that he described it as yellow suggests he was constructing details rather than recalling them. The inconsistency in the timeline, with Brian telling most people the incident happened around 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the evening, but telling the security guard it happened at 7 o'clock, creates another significant problem. The difference between 7 and 8 o'clock in early April in the Bahamas is the difference between daylight and darkness. At 7 in the evening, the sun has either just set or is setting, but there's still substantial twilight. Visibility is good, you can see clearly. At 8 o'clock, depending on how much time has passed since sunset, it's getting genuinely dark. Visibility is limited. These are fundamentally different scenarios with fundamentally different implications for what could or couldn't have been seen, what actions could or couldn't have been taken. Why would Brian tell one person it was still light and tell everyone else it was dark? The most likely explanation is that he hadn't yet settled on which version of the story worked better. Was it more plausible that Lynette went overboard in daylight when he should have been able to see her clearly, or in darkness when losing sight of her would be more understandable? He seems to have tried both versions with different audiences before settling on the darkness narrative. The flare evidence provides hard physical data that contradicts Brian's account. He told Lynette's mother he fired 2 flares. When the dinghy was recovered and examined, only 1 flare had been discharged. There was still an unfired flare in the flare gun. That's not ambiguous. That's not subject to interpretation. 1 flare was fired, not 2. But witnesses on shore reported seeing a flare that evening, and what they described is not consistent with a legitimate distress signal. Fired as a distress signal goes up, high into the air where it can be seen from the maximum distance possible. That's the entire purpose of a flare, to create a visible signal that can summon help from as far away as possible. The flare witnesses described went horizontally across the surface of the water. That's not how you fire a distress flare. That's not how anyone who genuinely needs help would use that resource. And witnesses reported that the flare appeared to come from the direction of Soulmate, not from a dinghy out in open water. What purpose be served by firing a flare horizontally from the direction of the anchored boat? What would that accomplish? The most logical explanation is that it was fired to create evidence that would support a narrative being constructed, not as a genuine call for help. The loud splash heard by a witness after 7:30 in the evening is another piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit the official narrative. By 9:30, according to Brian's timeline, he should have already been drifting for approximately 2 hours, miles away from Aunt Pat's Bay. Lynette should have already been in the water for those same 2 hours, swept away by current and wind, far from the anchored boat. But a witness heard a massive splash coming from the direction of Soulmate around 9:30. Loud enough to be notable, loud enough to remember, loud enough to report to investigators later when they started asking questions about unusual events that evening. What makes a loud splash in the ocean at night? Something heavy entering the water. Something with enough mass and velocity to create a sound that carries across the water to shore. Something being dropped or thrown from a boat would create exactly that kind of splash. The timing of this splash, combined with the AIS going offline at 9:29 just a minute earlier, creates a sequence of events that's difficult to explain within Brian's narrative. The AIS shuts down, cutting off the broadcast of the boat's position. A minute later, there's a loud splash from the direction of the boat. These 2 events happening in immediate succession is unlikely to be coincidental. The lights observed on Soulmate at midnight represent perhaps the most direct contradiction of Brian's account. At midnight, Brian claims to have been drifting helplessly at sea for approximately 4.5 hours, miles from the anchored boat, unable to control his movement or direction. Soulmate should have been completely empty, dark and quiet. But a resident with a view of the anchorage had video running that captured lights on what appears to be Soulmate at midnight. Not just lights that were left on, lights going on and off, movement. Low near the waterline, where someone would be working with a dinghy. Higher up on deck, where someone would be moving around in the cockpit. Lights going on and off indicates human activity. It indicates someone aboard the vessel, moving around, using different areas, turning lights on when they need illumination and off when they don't. An empty boat doesn't have lights that turn themselves on and off. An empty boat either has lights on because they were left on, or lights off because no one is there to turn them on. This video evidence, if it clearly shows what's been described, would place someone aboard Soulmate at midnight when the boat should have been unoccupied. Combined with the Starlink connection logs that would show what devices connected to the boat's network, combined with the battery management logs that would show electrical usage, combined with the security camera footage that would show who was aboard, this creates a comprehensive digital record of activity that contradicts the timeline Brian has provided. The mystery of the yacht Azora and its missing crew represents one of the most frustrating aspects of this investigation. Here was a vessel anchored immediately adjacent to Soulmate, close enough that its occupants would have had an unobstructed view of everything happening in that anchorage all evening and into the night. If Azora's crew was aboard their vessel that evening, they may have seen Lynette and Brian leave in the dinghy, or not leave. They may have seen the flare that went horizontally across the water. They may have heard the loud splash at 9:30. They may have observed the lights moving around on Soulmate at midnight. They may have seen someone returning to the boat during hours when it should have been empty. The Coast Guard Investigative Service has issued a formal appeal to locate these people, not a casual request, not a general call for anyone with information. A specific formal appeal to locate the owners and occupants of a specific vessel. The memo states that these people may have information relevant to the investigation, which is official language indicating that investigators believe these witnesses observed something significant. Yet despite this formal appeal, despite the international attention this case has received, despite the Internet's remarkable ability to locate and identify people when motivated to do so, Azora's occupants have not come forward or been located. Where are they? Why haven't they made themselves available to investigators? Do they not know they're being sought? Are they cruising in remote areas without internet access? Or is there another reason they haven't surfaced? The question has become a rallying cry in online discussions of this case. Where is Azora, the yacht that was there that night, that was close enough to see everything, that held witnesses who could corroborate or contradict Brian's account? Finding these people and hearing what they have to say could answer many of the questions that still surround this case. Lynette Hooker's history of domestic violence and Brian's specific threats to throw her overboard add a chilling context to her disappearance that cannot be ignored. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't someone with no history of violence suddenly committing an act completely out of character. This was a pattern that had been documented over years, that had been reported to police, that had been confided to friends, that had been serious enough to drive Lynette to plan her escape. The fact that Brian specifically threatened to throw Lynette overboard where nobody would find her is almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence, given that she subsequently disappeared from a boat under circumstances that are increasingly difficult to accept as accidental. He told her exactly what he would do. He described the method. He explained that the ocean would hide the evidence. And then months later, she vanished from a boat in the ocean. The timeline is significant. In 2024, during a separation period, Lynette confided Brian's threats to a close friend. In January of 2025, just 3 months before she disappeared, she mentioned those threats again. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't something from the distant past that had been resolved. This was an ongoing concern, a present fear, something that was serious enough that Lynette brought it up repeatedly with someone she trusted. The documented police report from 2015 provides official corroboration that domestic violence was part of this relationship's history. Lynette told responding officers that Brian had choked and struck her. The case was ultimately dropped, and Brian was not charged, but the incident was documented in an official police report with a case number and witness statements. This wasn't rumor or speculation. This was documented reality. Lynette's statement to friends during the separation period that she couldn't cruise with Brian anymore and couldn't be alone on a boat with him reveals the depth of her fear. For someone who loved the ocean, who had chosen the cruising life deliberately, who documented her joy in that lifestyle through thousands of social media posts, to say she couldn't be on a boat with her husband anymore indicates genuine terror. It wasn't about the cruising life itself. It was about being alone with Brian in an environment where help might be days or weeks away. Darlene Hamlet's account of the last time she saw her daughter is heartbreaking in its prescience. She told Lynette not to go back. She was afraid of what would happen. A mother's instinct that something was terribly wrong, that her daughter was returning to a dangerous situation, that this might be the last time she saw her child alive. And Lynette had a plane ticket, a concrete plan to leave, booked for March 11th, just 3 weeks before she disappeared. She had made the decision. She was getting out. Something happened in those 3 weeks that caused her to stay, or that prevented her from using that ticket. Some conversation, some promise, some pressure, some threat, and 3 weeks later, she was gone. Now, federal divers are going to GPS coordinates in 25-foot deep water, coordinates recorded by Brian's own devices, looking for a woman whose husband had threatened to throw her overboard where nobody would find her. The specificity of that threat matching so precisely with the current circumstances is impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The fact that 3 family members have all provided DNA samples indicates how seriously they're taking the possibility that Lynette's remains might be recovered from the search area indicated by GPS data. They're ready. They're waiting. They want their daughter, their mother, their loved one brought home, whatever condition she's in, wherever she's been for the past 54 days. The comment that captured the internet's attention, "Technology does not lie, only people do, somebody knows more, a lot more," represents a fundamental truth about this case. Every system on that boat, every device Brian and Lynette carried, every app they used, every network they connected to, it was all creating records. Perfect, indelible, irrefutable records of locations and times and actions and events. These systems don't have motives. They don't have narratives to protect. They don't care about the consequences of what they record. They simply log data with mechanical precision and store it on remote servers that exist beyond anyone's ability to access and delete after the fact. Brian may have understood the systems on his boat at a technical level. He may have known how they functioned, how to operate them, how to maintain them. But understanding how a system works is not the same as understanding all the places it stores data, all the servers it syncs to, all the redundant backups it creates automatically. A Garmin watch syncs to Garmin servers. Starlink logs connections on SpaceX's infrastructure. Battery management systems store logs locally, but also transmit data for remote monitoring. Security cameras upload to Amazon's cloud. Marine navigation apps sync tracks and waypoints to developer servers for backup and device synchronization. So the data persists. The GPS tracks showing where devices went that night. The connection logs showing what devices connected to the boat's network and when. The battery logs showing electrical usage patterns. The security footage showing who was aboard and what they were doing. All of it sitting on corporate servers, waiting for investigators with subpoenas to access it. And that's exactly what's happening now. The Coast Guard has brought federal resources to bear on this case. The FBI is processing evidence at Quantico. Multiple agencies are coordinating across international boundaries with the Royal Bahamas Police Force. Subpoenas are being served, data is being extracted. Digital forensic analysts are piecing together the complete picture of what happened that night. The decision to move Soulmate to Fort Lauderdale, specifically because that facility has the capability to pull the vessel completely out of the water signals that investigators want access to every square inch of that boat. They want to examine the hull below the waterline. They want to look at areas that have been submerged since April 4th. They want to check for evidence that would only be visible with the boat out of the water and accessible from all angles. And they want to preserve the vessel in its current state for potential legal proceedings. Pulling a boat, shrink-wrapping it, storing it in a secure facility, these are the actions you take when you expect that boat to become evidence in a criminal trial. When you need to be able to wheel it into a courtroom, and point to specific features, specific areas, specific evidence that it contains. The boat Lynette funded with her own resources, the boat she called home, the boat she maintained and improved with her own hands. That boat is now a crime scene being preserved for the prosecution of whoever is responsible for her disappearance. Federal divers are entering the water at coordinates that Brian's devices recorded, but that he never mentioned to investigators. They're going to 25-foot depths that would hide something from aerial observation, but that are easily accessible to divers. They're searching a specific location that GPS data indicates was deliberately visited and then departed from, not drifted past by helpless currents. What will they find? The answer to that question may come in hours or days. But the fact that Bahamian authorities have granted permission for this search, the fact that federal resources are being devoted to it, the fact that family DNA samples are standing by for immediate comparison, all of this indicates that investigators have strong reason to believe this search will be productive. Lynette Hooker chose the cruising life because she loved the ocean. She documented that love through thousands of posts, showing the beauty and challenges of life on the water. She called the ocean her happy place. She shared her joy in sailing and exploring and experiencing places most people only dream about. She deserves justice. She deserves to have the truth about what happened to her brought to light. She deserves to have the technology that surrounded her life tell the story that Brian won't tell. Brian thought he could outsmart the technology. He thought he understood it well enough to control the narrative. But he was wrong. The digital footprint was too extensive, too redundant, too distributed across too many independent systems for any one person to erase. Technology does not lie, and it's about to tell us everything. We're going to be here for every development that follows. When those divers surface, when the forensic analysis is complete, when charges are filed, when justice is served, this channel will be here covering every moment. If you have information about the night of April 4th, about the vessel Azora, about anything connected to this case, please submit it through the CGIS Tips application. Anonymous, iOS and Android, every detail matters. Every piece of information could be the one that makes everything else make sense. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when this breaks, when the divers find what they're looking for, when the truth finally comes out, you need to be here. 54 days Lynette has been missing. 54 days her family has waited for answers. 54 days this investigation has been building toward this moment. Technology does not lie, and federal divers are bringing Lynette home.